Hi, we're Oxygen Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. Merlin, welcome to the Shoot Room.
Thank you very much for having me, Rich.
Thank you for travelling up. Can you say who you are and describe what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. My name is Merlin Hanbury-Tenison. I'm the managing director of a charity called the Thousand Year Trust, which is the UK's only temperate rainforest charity. I also run a wellness retreat space on Bodmin Moor called Cabilla Cornwall, which is in the heart of a temperate rainforest.
Nice. So, career contents page. Thing we asked the guests to do when they first arrived. Take us through the chapters that make up your story and your career, please.
Sure. So I'm a Cornishman. I was born down in Cornwall, and my family have been down there for centuries. I grew up on Bodmin Moor on this place Cabilla, which I'll talk about a lot more, I'm hoping. Left when I was a teenager to join the army, and spent a decade in the British Army, and during that time did 3 tours in Afghanistan. Which
was that a family driver for the army? Was that why? What was your reason?
So much my parents, neither of my parents had been in the military, and none of my siblings went that direction either. I did have a number of uncles who'd served, and so it was there's definitely a military element to the family, which it was lovely to be a part of. And so I spent a decade in the British Army and time out in Afghanistan, came home left the army in 2012, went to London, where I was getting married at the time, and my wife Lizzie, her career was in London, so I decided I'd spend a few years there before coming home to the farm. Spent about nearly 8 years living and working in London before returning to Bodmin Moor to try and make something of the small upland hill farm that is where our family lives.
Nice. 2012 must have been a really exciting time to be around London with everything Olympic-wise and stuff.
It really was. I remember that well, actually. And I was just leaving the army at the time and still had my army ID card, which was brilliant because there were so many military people who were helping with the Olympics that there were opportunities to get involved, which was a really fantastic time.
Awesome. So, Cornwall, where you were born, where you grew up, clearly a love of it. Why? Why did you connect so well with it? What is it about that place?
I think ask any Cornishman or Cornish woman that, and they'll assume you should know the answer. You know, Cornwall is I think a very special place. Everywhere in the UK is beautiful and special, but we have our deep Celtic traditions down there. The Cornish don't consider themselves to be part of the UK or part of England. We're part of the UK, but not part of England at all. So when you cross from Devon into Cornwall over the Tamar, you are crossing a national boundary. There's a lot of pride, a lot of sense of place, but also I think a lot of that comes from the fact that Cornwall is in the lowest socioeconomic bracket in the UK.
I think so many people are surprised by that when they hear it.
They really are, and I talk to people about this a lot when I'm taking groups through the rainforest, that we think of the north-south divide in the UK and that the south is very wealthy and the north has more struggles with socioeconomic issues and poverty, whereas actually our most southern area has been our poorest area since the mid-1700s when the mining economy collapsed. So the population of Cornwall is about 575,000 people, but during the 1700s, that went up as high as 1.5 million at a time when there were so many people living and working in many of these inland Cornish towns, places like Bodmin, Liskeard, Launceston, St Austell, Campbell, and Redruth, very focused on the mining industry. And when that collapsed and the Cornish many of them emigrated to places like the eastern seaboard of Canada, the US and Mexico, Argentina, and took a lot of their mining expertise with them, Cornwall has never recovered from that and continues to be a place where I always joke that you can draw the economy of Cornwall with a Sharpie on the map around the boundary because it's all within a mile of the coastline and it's all very seasonal. And I think it bonds the Cornish together, but it also creates a lot of issues and problems as well.
On that sort of regional, national divide, how did you square that, being a proud person from Cornwall, but also serving your country in the forces? Where did that feel for you?
I mean, I'm proud to be British, and I think it's the British Army, and yeah, we all serve the United Kingdom, and so that was never a factor. And there are a lot of Cornish people who join the military. A lot of them go into the Navy because it has a strong seafaring tradition, so it's rarer for people to join the army. But I was always very proud to serve my country.
Most of the people I have met who have that love of Cornwall is always coast first and sea first. And interestingly, that's not your connection, right? Yours is the rainforest and Bodmin Moor and the sort of inner bits of Cornwall, which is unique.
Wherever you are in Cornwall, you're never that far from the coast. Yeah. I'm a surfer and I love the Cornish beaches as well. But we are about as far away from the coast as you can get in Cornwall. And Cornwall Council has 3 sort of drivers in its strategy, which are to reduce seasonality, reduce pressure on the coastline, and provide more employment for young people. And with what we're trying to do on Bodmin Moor is trying to hit all three of those. We're trying to make sure we have a business which can be open 12 months of the year, so that you don't have this real issue with seasonality where young people can get short-term holiday jobs, but they can't have careers because there's no consistency. We're trying to reduce some of that pressure from the coastline by providing places where people can come in a meaningful and mindful way inland, and also there's a nice story around the employment aspect that when my father took the farm over in 1960, it employed 8 people full time, and this is a time when most families were single earning households, so that's eight homes, that's 8 schools, 8 village shops, and the rural economy was being backed by these quite small upland hill farms, which were in very diversified rotational farming cycles. Due to the Common Agricultural Policy and many of the things that happened in the preceding 60 years, efficiency became a real goal. And when I took the farm over in 2016, it was only employing maybe one contract worker for half of the year. And so we'd gone from 8 people down to half a person. And for Lizzie, my wife, and me, it was always our dream to be able to provide more employment on the farm through nature restoration and ecotourism. Well, it's not really ecotourism, but what we're doing on the farm than we were doing back in 1960. So we had as our goal to be able to employ more than 8 people, and we now employ 14 people. So we've been able to do better than upland hill farming was doing back in the 1960s, now in 2023.
That's awesome. What a story. So take us home. Tell us about your place and what it's like. Take people on a virtual visit there if they haven't had the opportunity to go yet.
So Bodmin Moor is a really wild and windswept place. Anyone who's read Daphne du Maurier or watched Poldark will know what it can be like. Those are always 2 good sort of cultural reference points. And it can be, we're about to enter into the long dark winter now, and it can be a tough place. But the valleys that go, Bodmin Moor is like a giant sponge under pressure. So you've got water being forced up underground, and it's filtered through granite, then through peat, then through moss. It's like nature's brittle water filter. And you have these incredibly pure rivers flowing north and south. And on Bodmin Moor, they flow north into the Camel and they flow south into the Foy. And you have these wonderful steep-sided riverine valleys, which, as you and I both know, 3,000 years ago would all have been thick and dense in this wonderful habitat, temperate rainforest. And because of what we humans have done over the last few thousand years by putting a lot of sheep on those lands, a non-native creature, they've been sheep-pocked and compacted soil down and down and down until now you just have this green tarmac everywhere on a lot of it, and these bleak, windswept, treeless tors all over the moors as well. Now, Cabilla is one of these valleys that comes off the south of Bodmin Moor, and we have a 300-acre farm, which is 100 acres of woodland and about 200 acres of grade 4 grazing land, so quite agriculturally poor land. And the more and more that Lizzie and I started to explore the forest that I'd grown up in and know intimately, but never really, not being an ecologist or a scientist by trade, had really dug into under the soil of what was happening there, we initially began to discover that by looking at the Doomsday records and then all of the records every 50 years since then, we could see that this forest was extant from 1086. So we knew we had at least 1,000 years of uninterrupted growth, death, regrowth, that cycle of life. And with 98% of our ancient woodlands having been cut down, this is an incredibly rare habitat because of its age. And then we started partnering very closely with the Eden Project, who came and did a long-term paleobotanical peat core survey to look at actually what was going on beneath the soil and the age of that habitat. And it was it always makes me chuckle because they were very reticent to send us their findings. They wanted to be more specific, and they were very apologetic and said, we wish we could be more specific, but we can tell you that this forest is at least 3,664 years old, give or take 29 years. I said, guys, that's just great.
I can work with that.
I can work with that.
Yeah.
So we know we have at least 3.5, probably 4,000 years of growth within this valley, and it's given us this wonderfully eclectic and biodiverse and abundant habitat where we have 100 acres of this gorgeous woodland, and then the grazing land on the sides, which traditionally is what I was brought up to think of as the business model, as the driver. That's where you grow more grass, you put more animals on it, you have a stronger business model. It just doesn't compare. So for us, it was always about figuring out how, rather than trying to maximize the grassland we have and cut back the forest, it was about expanding the forest and perhaps having a little bit less grassland and seeing whether we could make a business and a movement behind that.
It's amazing. One thing to pick up on, I adore the passion you have for the place. So because the way my career's progressed, I've lived in a different place a year for 20 years. And it means I don't have that emotional connection with any place. Hugely fortunate we have an amazing array of estates that I can go and enjoy and play in and experience and see the environment, the whole range of what it can do. But I don't have that emotional grounding or connection to one landscape. It's really special to hear you talk about yours.
And I feel I'm grateful every day and feel very lucky to have that, because it is a special place and it is beautiful.
So you have an array of fascinating visitors that come and stay and spend some time with you. Let's talk about some of those. Who comes to mind?
Sure. So the reason we set up the business that we run on the farm, Cabilla, was really based on Lizzie's and my personal experiences. So I suffered quite a lot of PTSD when I left the military. I'd been blown up in a roadside bomb in Afghanistan and been in a number of quite challenging situations out there, as many veterans had been. And in 2017, I had a breakdown when I was working up in London. And it was really the valley and the forest that was, for me, a huge part of my healing journey. And Lizzie, in her own and very personal way, when we were trying to start a family, was suffering from a number of miscarriages and found quite what an undiscussed subject that is. And
we've been there too.
And it's hellish for families to go through it, and it needs to be something that's shared and talked about, because it helps. And everybody's experiences are so individual, but I think by community and sharing, we can all help ourselves to kind of get to a better place. And for both of us, the value was really important. And we had that moment of realizing that, of course, there's issues around making all land completely public access. And we've seen that with Wistman's Wood on Dartmoor, where it's been quite damaged because it's been used by people who don't necessarily know how to respect and treat the land. So we wanted to create that balance of bringing in the groups that needed it as much as possible, while still always putting nature first and always putting the environment that we had in that valley first, and making sure it was always being protected ahead of us as the people who needed it. And so we've built this place where we could bring veterans also suffering from PTSD, groups of people who might be carrying their own trauma, who need to find ways to heal. And we work very closely with the Florence Nightingale Foundation, who look after NHS nurses. And we bring senior nurses from the NHS into the habitat who are suffering from stress and burnout from COVID and the state of the NHS, to be able to heal as well. And bringing this diversity of groups has been the most wonderful journey for the last few years, supported by incredible clinical experts and facilitators who can take them down into our most healing and ancient environment.
Where do those people come from? Where do the specialists that help support the visitors come from? How does that develop?
So we've been incredibly lucky with the people who support us and the people who we've been able to get to know over the last few years. And that comes from, some groups come with their own experts, but we also have an amazing community around us on Bodmin Moor of people who have a huge background, whether it's in more of the traditional wellness side of life. So it might be people who are amazing yoga practitioners, breathwork practitioners, Wim Hof, sound therapy, somatic release and therapy, or whether it's people from that more clinical kind of talking therapy and psychoanalysis side of things. We always want to make sure people are held within a container and supported in the safest way possible.
It's those topics that aren't talked about. I go back to over the last 10 years, I think we've made so much progress in that, in terms of the things that are outed and spoken about and people actually having those conversations, and nature in the environment and nature-based prescription. It's just such a fulcrum and an opportunity to make those conversations easier. So we too are fortunate enough to have an area of rainforest on Dartmoor, and you can physically see people transform as soon as you walk them into the environment. So I always remember one where we had a property developer friend of ours who was going through a really rough patch, who came to visit the place. And like you, we're very cautious about when we spend time in the rainforest, because our footsteps do damage there, right? And he walked in, and you could see his shoulders drop, his breathing like relax. And it's like Narnia, these places, in terms of the effect they have on them. And it is magic. So for those of you who haven't, please go visit. Incredible opportunity.
You say it's like Narnia. I mean, it genuinely is. People often, I do a rainforest tour at the start of every retreat group that we have coming in. We insist that one of the first things they do is a 2-hour-long tour through the rainforest to really ground and release. And I always ask groups who didn't think we had rainforests in the UK, and even after Wild Isles, even after the Aviva funding, after Guy Shrubsole's incredible book, The Lost Rainforests of Britain, which everyone should read and recently won the Wainwright Prize. There's still about 80%, 60 to 80% of people within a group.
And you encourage some of them to go barefoot?
Whenever I can.
Yeah,
whenever
nice.
I can. Oh, absolutely. Because there's a huge grounding opportunity with that as well. But there's still always 60 to 80% of people who didn't think that rainforests were in the UK, that we had them at all. And in explaining to people what this habitat is, I always say, well, think of the Arthurian legends, think of the Jabberwocky, the Mabinogion, think of Tolkien's Fangorn Forest from the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, and like you say with Narnia, these are all stories, folkloric stories based within Atlantic temperate rainforest. We just weren't calling it that. And now because we've cut so much of it down, we've gone from 20% of the UK down to 0.4% of the UK, we've forgotten that it's in our soul, it's home.
When we went to visit the Leon estate for the first time, which we were fortunately able to purchase, the agent selling it showed us the house and went, "Oh, you don't want to see the land, do you?" We were like, "We'd quite like to, yeah," which was the reason we were there. Yeah. So, yeah, it was a nice surprise, the rainforest, just how developed and amazing it was. So you talked about the age of your existing woodland that's there. Talk to us about the next 1,000 years.
Sure. So the reason the charity is called the 1,000-Year Trust is there's a number of reasons. The real reason I first came to it was because I wanted us to really champion the oak tree. In temperate rainforests, especially in the southwest, 80% of the trees, the paramount species is the sessile oak, the Celtic oak, Quercus petraea. And these are these wonderful 1,000-year creatures that take 300 years to live, can live for 400 years, and then take 300 years to die and rot back down. And that death phase is, as we know, the most important phase of the life cycle. And I wanted to try and encourage people to stop thinking like humans in 2 to 5 year sprints and start thinking like an oak tree, start thinking a long term over the horizon. Think of the year 3023. We're not equipped to do it because it's so far outside of our frame of reference that it's distant. And if we can start planting trees and creating habitats which will thrive in that time, then we're really making a change against the climate crisis. And the three things I always say that temperate rainforest is our pinnacle habitat in the UK is firstly for carbon sequestration. Because of all of the epiphytes and everything living amongst the canopy, it's sequestering more carbon than any other terrestrial habitat that we have in the UK. The second is biodiversity abundance, because of all of the many multifarious things. The fact that an oak tree can have 600 species living on it at once, you won't find an environment with more things packed into a small space. And when it comes to nature restoration, I think if you want to be very simplistic about it, creating more biodiversity abundance is the easiest way to go about it in an equilibrium state where everything's not in conflict with each other and something's going up and something's going down. But then, as you were saying before, the third thing that rainforests are so great for is mental health and well-being. And I think that's the way to engage people. And it's because of these terpenes, these volatile organic compounds being secreted by the trees during the photosynthetic process, which has this incredible impact upon the human physiology. So 30 minutes in a temperate rainforest and you can measure the drop in your cortisol 2 weeks later in our stress hormones. It improves your kidney function, your immune system response. It puts us on our parasympathetic nervous system. So for all of those reasons, this 1,000-year timeline is so important. And where we're looking to, so the farm sits within Bodmin Moor, and Bodmin Moor is this wonderful mosaic where, unlike Dartmoor and Exmoor, which are national parks and are a bit more contained, where you have the moor and then you have the farmland surrounding it, Bodmin Moor, you have farms surrounded by commons all over the place, and it's much more of a patchwork. And we are surrounded on all sides by common, and all of these commons, all of these areas of heathland and moorland and acid grassland would have been not blanket closed canopy forest, but they would have had a dominant habitat of temperate rainforest once upon a time. And Bodmin Moor is a 50,000 acre wilderness with very few people living on it, very few people farming it, and very little profitability within the farming system. And the opportunity to return this habitat over the next 1,000 years, over the next 10 years, but with a view for many centuries ahead of us is, I think, really exciting, and could potentially be one of the most exciting nature restoration projects in the UK, if not in Western Europe.
Completely agree. The 3 points you hit, agree with all three. I'd add a fourth, that it is so iconic and visually striking that even the people we can't get physically to the place, the photography and the videography and the stories we can tell of it are such a way of inspiring the next generation about the environment as well. So it's a reach beyond any other environment that you don't need to be in, you can still enjoy and celebrate it.
I always feel bad comparing it to peat, because peat is so important and such a vital habitat, but no one's finding peat sexy. Whereas rainforests, it's quite hard to not make them sexy. And
you need to apologise to our director of natural capital, who is currently crying. He loves peat. He loves peat. Yeah.
And it's the same with seagrass. I have a very good friend who works in seagrass restoration, and it's such an important habitat. It sequesters carbon so quickly. Yeah. But again, like you say about people not being able to visit the habitats, they have to be visually compelling. They have to have folkloric elements. They have to engage the heart, not just the head. And it's a bit more like coral reefs. many of us will never see a coral reef, we'll never go to the Great Barrier Reef and see a really beautiful
Still
reef.
iconic, right?
But we all know how iconic it is, and we all want to save it, even if we won't go there, because we know how special it is. And I think our Atlantic rainforests have the same sort of hook to them.
Kind of having this double loop about nature restoration in the UK at the moment. So your temporal element is so important, because funds and investors want to think about quarterly returns and monthlies and annual finances. Nature doesn't care. It needs to think way, way beyond there. So what's been really fortunate about us, we've found investors and partners who are thinking about finances through a nature lens rather than trying to force it the other way. So we're trying to make sure the numbers stack up in a way that's meaningful to investors, but at the same time sell and tell emotional and iconic stories. So same problem of nature restoration, but coming at it from two completely different perspectives.
Yeah, and I think that impact investing and that kind of that long-term financial view is growing. We've gone through a period, and dare I say, a more sort of the last 30, 40 years, a very masculine focused mindset around that financial and corporate world.
But it's kind of the same thing happening in farming, right? More efficient, hammer the result.
Short term.
Yeah, I don't care about the consequences. Just,
someone
totally.
else's problem in the future.
Yeah.
Now we're moving into an age where I think there's more care, there's more long-term thinking, and that's creating the opportunity for these conversations around we can do this, and some of the conversations we're having with the 1,000 Year Trust around funding partners, and I'm sure they'll be similar to some of the conversations you're having. There's people start with that quantitative lens immediately, so they say how many tons of CO2, how quickly, when can we start, what are we buying by giving money to this charity, what can we put in our report in terms of thousands of tons of CO2 that we've sequestered. And they're all currently working with mangrove plantations in Southeast Asia, and I have this conversation daily about saying, have you checked that there's audit, there's governance, and that you're not double.
That there's land ownership, that you haven't displaced someone, that you're getting what you
There's not a middleman who's just selling you an idea, which
the draining of the colour from the face when you ask people, that's sometimes striking, right?
Absolutely. And but at the same time, moving to that more qualitative approach of saying, well, of course we can give you the figures on the amount that's being sequestered, but also can we
keep going, it's fine. Our next guests arrive, but we're going to keep rocking on for a second.
Of course we can give you the figures, but could we also perhaps think about the story that you're creating? Because there's a decolonization element to ESG about saying, well, rather than offshoring everything and spending all of these huge amounts of money that's washing around for nature restoration, forcing the global south to do things that we have already got so wrong in the last few hundred years.
Completely.
Maybe we could be fixing our own back door, backyard, before we start forcing other people to do things they might not be comfortable with.
Yeah, and that is a perfect time for us to take a quick break, and we'll be back with part two. Welcome back. So, a lot of focus on home for you and what you're doing on the ground there. So if we come to some of the bigger issues we're all facing in the environment sector, you mentioned commoners. So how is that working for you in terms of relationships? And from our perspective, it's been a barrier to environmental progress at the minute. What are you experiencing and feeling out there?
Yeah, if you're going to do it the hardest way you can, and common land is definitely the hardest area for nature restoration. I would imagine. I'm sure there are areas that people would argue are more challenging, but I haven't come across anything more challenging than that. There are so many different voices, so many people with a veto and a vested interest, so many stakeholders to manage, and we've seen it because our key project that we're doing, and which fundamentally on our home farm, the project we're running, is a case study demonstration site. And the whole point of what we're doing with an agroforestry system of mob grazing and silver pasture using native breeds that runs through a temperate rainforest restoration program is to be able to demonstrate to other upland hill farmers and say, you currently make X by farming sheep and a bit of cattle. You could make Y by farming rainforests with agroforestry running through it. We're going to help you bridge that chasm and move across from one to the other. Now, these are difficult conversations, but the most important thing, from my perspective, is remembering that the average upland hill farmer on Bodmin, Moor and Dartmoor takes between 85 and 92% of their income from EU subsidies. This is 9/10 funded, this industry, from from the historic European Union subsidies that are now underwritten by the Treasury, but are all ending by 2027. Yeah. My neighbour, who's a good friend and farms sheep in a big way, he has 4,000 sheep. He sheared them all 2 months ago to remove the wool and to get them ready. And it cost him £5,000 to shear them. It cost £1.30 to shear each sheep. And he got paid £1,000 for the fleeces, 25p a fleece. There is no business model here. And So whereas 6 years ago when we started the project, all my neighbours, all the farmers around us would hear about it and go, well, it sounds mad and what you're doing is crazy and we'd never do that. 3 years ago, they were all looking at me and going, could you send me a bit of information about that? Because it looks interesting and we're actually quite curious because we're making less and less money and your farming model seems to look quite healthy. And in the last 6 months, people have started coming to me and going, would you like to partner and how can we get in on this? And that's
So you are seeing that change. You are seeing as the reduction in subsidies starting to bite, people are looking for an alternative.
Absolutely, because the uplands, we have this narrative which is a really politically charged one around cultural heritage.
Yeah.
And as soon as I hear it, for me, it's a real red flag as soon as someone says bored about cultural heritage, because generally what they mean is, what about the way we've done things since the Second World War?
Yes.
That's usually what cultural heritage means. What about the last 80 years?
Yeah.
And the last 80 years has seen one of the biggest declines in natural abundance and in species richness, especially in the UK, that has ever been.
The phrase we get is, we've always done it.
Yeah.
And they mean that exact same time
You
period.
mean we've done it since 1945?
Yes.
And that's again comes back to that name of the 1,000-year trust, is we need to think 1,000 years forward and 1,000 years backwards and really test it objectively and go, what is the right way to manage these lands for humans, but also for food production, for wildlife, for the cultural heritage and the look of the land. And it isn't what's been done for the last 80 to 100 years, not always. And the answer to this, I believe, is the landscape scale recovery programs, which have been launched by DEFRA and are an opportunity to bring smaller farmers together to be able to collaborate and actually create change at scale. The average farm across the UK is 220 acres. And so when you hear of these large-scale rewilding projects done by incredibly inspirational trailblazers, like people like the Burrells at Knepp and Paul Lister at Allerdale and Anders Poulsen and greats like Ben Goldsmith, incredible people doing great things, they're doing it because they're able to be those first movers, whereas actually the 220-acre upland hill farmer whose farm makes £9,000 a year, they need there to be a financially resilient business model behind it, and they need a community to do it with.
So before we come on to partnership, the other challenge we're having around commoners is the absent commoner, the commoner who holds rights historically, isn't actively farming, and its perspective is, I just don't want it to change.
Yeah, I like walking my dog across it. I have common rights, and I like being able to say that, and therefore I don't think anything should change. Let's maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The two most striking ones I always remember is one group of commoners we were with, and the group said, we've spoken to this lady who has common rights, and she's mortified by the state of the moor. She doesn't even leave the house anymore, and she's mortified. And I said, if she doesn't leave the house, how does she understand the state of the moor? Oh, we've told her it's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And we had another striking one, crofting land up in Scotland, with people who said, well, I just don't want anything to change. And I said, how do we approach the future in a way that's more sustainable and tries to be regenerative? What do we say to our kids and grandkids? And the answer was, I don't care, I'm going to be dead.
Exactly. And I think that's the natural, in some ways, it's the next negative phase of shifting baseline syndrome, is we all live in a world where we think what it was like when we were children was how the world should be. And then when you're speaking to commoners who have control over what happens in certain areas of land, and they might be in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're going, well, the best way for land to be is how it was in the 60s and 70s, which is actually when a lot of these really negative practices came in. You're going, well, this is, you're aiming towards a situation which is not positive. And then, but the answer to it is many, many very long, very painful conversations with people, and allowing the financial impetus to bite a little bit, because as those subsidies go down, the people who actually are grazing the commons.
My worry is it's those vetoes, though, because with the absent commoners who aren't actively using the landscape, but they still remain a veto to say, no, I don't want it to change. Yeah. That subsidy isn't going to hit them, because there's one common group we're associated with, and I think the subsidy equates to like £90 a year or something, because there's that many commoners. So it's not going to bite in the same way as to the farmer. It's their principal income.
And it's a problem. It is a problem that needs very careful management. There are 350 commoners on Bodmin Moor, and of which only about 10% of them are actually actively grazing. Yeah. The rest are either just not using their commons rights, or they're absent commoners completely. Now, they're the challenging ones, because the 10% that are using their rights, they will feel the bite and they will want to do different things. Yeah. The 90% that aren't, they're the ones who go, well, I don't really care and I quite like it as it is. I read Jamaica Inn, and I think that these bleak windswept hills is
what it should be.
And the potential is so much higher of all these ghost woods being regenerated.
So my rule with the government is largely assume they're going to do nothing, and if they do something, it's not going to help. If anyone's listening to this, this is where you can actually help, changing the way that legislation works in relation to common land, and actually setting up a way to deliver your own environment plan and the 25-year strategy. Unless you sort out some of these common issues, so much of the land is going to be vetoable straight out of recovery. One of the things that's really impressed me with you is your ability, calmness and kindness when it comes to working in partnership. How are you as patient as you are with some of these veto people, some of these people who just do not want to see things moving forward for the better?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. I don't always feel calm and patient, but I try.
Go home and hit the wall.
Where's most of frustration?
Yeah.
Exactly. I get out.
You go to the rainforest.
Go to the forest and scream.
Yeah.
I used to get far more frustrated, and for me actually, and it feels a little bit sort of trite to say this, but there's been a big part of really trying to embody what we're trying to do with the 1,000-year trust about live that long time frame. And as soon as I've started to really understand that myself, I've realized that it's not a question of if we can do these things, it's a question of when. I have no doubt that in 1,000 years' time, there will be a lot of temperate rainforest in the UK. Maybe not 20%, but will be at least 10% from the 0.4% we're at now. And there'll probably be far fewer humans. What I would like to see is that we make these changes through our own choice and agency and intention, not because we end up sleepwalking into a situation where there's something horrible that happens, like a war, a famine, a plague, or climate change just absolutely collapsing our society.
Yeah.
And I think we're still at a point now, I believe we're still at a point, we have to believe we're at a point where if we were to make large-scale systemic change now, we could avert some of the most acute impacts of these catastrophes. But regardless, whether we do or not, none of us are going to be around to see it, and we're going to get the rainforest back. I would just like to be a part of making sure that humans get there in an enjoyable way, not in a really unpleasant way.
I've written very similar, not put as eloquently as you did, but we either have to choose to do something or the choice won't be ours.
And it comes down to that line, which is often used, which is that nature will be fine. It's humans that might not be. And that's not strictly true, because we could create an effect where nature is not fine for a long time before it slowly becomes fine again.
Yeah.
Or we can make sure that nature really never has to go off a cliff and that we're at the bottom of the bell curve now. And this is the nadir. This is the low moment from which we all, with intention, pull ourselves back up to a place of a little bit more ecosystem health.
From when we first met, as soon as you said there's going to be more rainforest as a result of what we do, I believed everything you said that there would be, because of your will and energy and enthusiasm. And I think throughout my career, I found, I was about to say businesses, but not businesses, people who are so insistent, so passionate and so enthusiastic about their vision and mission that they're just going to make it happen. And I believe you are. And as a result of that, we're in the process of trying to buy a site in Cornwall to help that come true. So that's your fault, good or bad. So my final question, we are at this fulcrum, this point, this nadir. What gives you hope about the future of the environment in this country?
So to sort of follow on from your last point around that belief, because I think hope and belief always have to be quite intrinsically linked. There's a great book around how we build that belief and hope that my wife read and then made me read, and I was very glad that she did, called The Source by an author called Dr. Tara Swart. And she says very early on in that the only difference between people who achieve things and people who don't, it's not talent, it's not intellect, it's not money, it's not capability, and thank God it isn't, because I definitely wouldn't achieve anything if it was any of those things. It is simply their relentless refusal to ever accept defeat and to continue marching forward and believing that they can do it. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think you get hope by continuing to refuse to let despair come in. So that's one element. I also think that we're seeing a real movement both in society but also in the financial markets. And you understand this, I think, better than most people will, in terms of how these two things have to be linked. And there's always been this big divide between the urban world, the rural world, the conservation world, and the agricultural world around financial markets and environmentalists. And these have always been at polar sides of the conversation. And I think the most exciting thing is watching these people come together, these groups come together, because it's only when, and the Aviva funding for temperate rainforest, or in general for nature restoration, Aviva gave £100 million, which they split, I think it was 3 ways. 1/3 went to seagrass, 1/3 went to salt salt flat restoration, 1/3's gone to Ireland for Northern Ireland for restoration, 1/3's gone to temperate rainforest loosely. That's a big amount of money. It's not enough money to fix the problems that we have, but it's a start. And when we see big organizations like Aviva pledging large amounts of money, like £100 million, towards really important nature restoration projects, and they are the first movers, and another 50 businesses will follow in the next 10 years because you and I are going to make them, and they're going to pledge big pots of money towards doing this, then it just becomes about actually getting the work done. And we've come out of a time where we're shaking tins and buckets and trying to get people to give a fiver, knowing that the ability to change stuff with these small amounts is challenging, to now we're seeing the people who traditionally may have done bad things because they weren't focused on the natural world, or they were greenwashing, or they were just outsourcing or offshoring, realizing that their investors, their stakeholders, the community that use their products won't go for it anymore. So it all comes down to how conscious we all are in the UK and internationally about what the businesses we support are doing. And we're seeing it more and more. We want to eat food that isn't a product of cruelty. We want to wear clothes that aren't a product of slavery. We want to use bath products and burn candles that are organic and haven't had lots of neonicotinoids and pesticides sprayed upon them. The more we make these choices, the more businesses have to support the actions which will actually help to reverse the decline that we've seen. So that gives me huge hope.
I completely agree. The realization in the big businesses there is no business case for ending life on Earth.
Yes.
It's no good for anyone.
But even closer to that, because that still comes to a slightly longer term view, but I think even closer to that is they're just realizing that it's not about how cheap your product is. There will always be a market for that, but more and more the space for how authentic your product is and what you're actually doing as a business, that's what people care about.
It's the most important word. So the thing we're finding from doing shoot room sessions, the best conversations we have are with the people who feel comfortable to sit down and be authentic themselves. We've had a couple of conversations for people that the cameras aren't rolling, amazing conversation, the cameras come on and it goes really dry because a person doesn't feel comfortable to be authentically them. So when the camera goes off, they are them, comes back on. And that's been one of the beauties of talking about you. It's exactly the same as whether the cameras were here or not. Merlin, I hugely appreciate you coming in the time, a fantastic conversation. That's your shoot room session. Thank you very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to be here.
Thanks, guys.